All right, guys, what we've tried to do is we've tried to go through a cumulative case, cover a lot of objections, establish the existence of truth, the existence of God, the possibility that God works in the world via miracles, all the way up to the reliability of the scriptures, but there's still the resurrection, obviously, but there's still one last charge remaining. Now, I think this charge is rather silly in light of the evidence for the resurrection of Christ, but this last charge would be, well, you know that Jesus never actually claimed to be God. Jesus did not identify as God. This was just a later addition or interpolation among his, or provided by his followers. He never claimed it. Look in the New Testament text. Don't look at the epistles. Don't look at the writings or the letters after the New Testament Gospels. Just look at those Gospels and you'll notice that Jesus actually never claimed to be God. No, actually he didn't in the sense say, hey guys, guess what? I've got a secret to tell you. I'm God. Now, there's some good reasons that Jesus didn't do it that way, and we'll have resources for you to check those reasons out. But the charge still doesn't stick that Jesus didn't claim to be God. One, it's completely ignorant of the Jewish culture, the Jewish context, and the claims that Jesus actually does make, which we're going to look at. Before we look at that, though, Rob Bowman has co-authored a book with another outstanding scholar, and they give this argument. It's called the HANDS argument. It's just an acronym, meaning that Jesus has the honors of God, Jesus has the attributes of God, Jesus has the names of God, and we'll go into those. Jesus has the deeds, and Jesus sits on the throne of God. HANDS. Each of those, just the acronym, you can figure that out. The HANDS, the honors of God, would be that Jesus accepts worship as God. The attributes of God would be that we see that Jesus is spoken of or claims to be eternal, uncreated. The names, we'll go into those in just a second. The deeds would be that Jesus judges, Jesus forgives, and the seat of the throne, that we see that Jesus claims, specifically in the book of Mark, to be on the seat of God, or Jesus claims to be on the throne of God. So if Jesus has the honors, the attributes, the names, the deeds, and sits on the throne of God, if A is equal to B is equal to C, then A has to be equal to C, that Jesus has this radical self-understanding that he actually is God. Now, setting that argument aside for the moment, and again, we've got resources at the end so that you can look into that if that's compelling to you. But we want to answer the charge straight up that Jesus never actually claimed to be God. Now, the first thing we have to keep in mind is Jesus' culture, Jesus' context, the Jewish people, the community. They understood exactly the claims that Jesus was making of himself. Now, just to go through a couple of these scriptures, remember, we've tried to establish that these are accurate, or they're reliable, that they're trustworthy. Not necessarily saying that Jesus is God at this moment. We're just trying to show you that Jesus had a radical self-understanding. In fact, he had a divine understanding to be equal in nature with God himself. Now, check out just a couple verses. In Exodus 3, this is the Old Testament. In Exodus 3, we see Jehovah or Yahweh saying that I am God, there is no other. Exodus 20, we see that Jehovah again is saying, or Yahweh saying, nothing is to be worshipped or served except me, Jehovah or Yahweh. Isaiah 44, he says, I am the first, I am the last. That's what Jehovah or Yahweh is saying in the Old Testament. I am the first, I am the last. Isaiah 42, Jehovah says, no one gets my glory. I'm God, no one else, no one gets my glory. Isaiah 43, we see that Jehovah says, there's no God before me, there's no God formed after me. In Isaiah 43, Jehovah says, Isaiah 45, there's no other God beside me. If there's another formed, I know nothing of it. Jehovah says these are his titles. These are the truths about Jehovah or Yahweh. These are just a scratching of the surface. Again, we'll give you resources that go much more in depth to establish that there's just one God. There's no other God the Old Testament clearly establishes or clearly proclaims. Now here's the transition that we want to look at. Jesus, just like everyone in his Jewish community, they understand this strong, monotheistic religious system that they all observe as Jews. They know that there's but one God, and they know the titles that this God has identified himself by. Now, what do we see Jesus doing in the New Testament? And this is where the objectors and the skeptics that want to claim that Jesus didn't claim to be God, this is where that charge falls off the rails. Now check these out. This is what Jesus starts to say of himself throughout the New Testament. He takes these titles that his audience knows, and he applies them to himself. So in Psalm 23, Jehovah says, I am the shepherd of Israel. In John 10, Jesus says, he is the shepherd of Israel. In Joel 3, God, Jehovah, Yahweh, says that he is to judge the nations. In Matthew 25 and in John 5, Jesus says he is to judge the nations. Isaiah 42, Jehovah says, no one gets my glory. John 17, Jesus says, Father, glorify me with the glory that I've shared with you from eternity. Isaiah 62, Hosea 2, Jehovah is the bridegroom of Israel. This is Yahweh saying that he is the bridegroom of Israel. And in Matthew 25, Jesus says what? He is the bridegroom of Israel. Along in other places he says this. Jeremiah 31 says only God, and this is among other places, Jeremiah 31 says only God forgives sin. You don't have to know anything about the New Testament text that Jesus everywhere within the Gospels says that he forgives sin. Everything that God is doing, we see Jesus doing, claiming these titles for himself. 1 Samuel 2, God says he is the giver of life. Jehovah, Yahweh says he is the giver of life. In John 5, among other places, Jesus says he is the giver of life. Now, again, his Jewish audience, the Jewish context understands that Jesus is taking these claims of the one true God and applying them to himself as if he is co-equal or shares the same nature or is God himself. In fact, what was what happened to Jesus? What was the charge brought against Jesus as to what he was doing wrong? He was charged with blasphemy, calling himself God. In fact, we see in John 8 where Jesus says, the Jewish leaders come before him and they say, who are you? Jesus says, I am. That is the name that God has set aside for himself in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. I am. Jesus tells the Jewish leaders, I am. They picked up stones to kill him for blasphemy because he said that he, a mere man, according to them, was claiming to be God himself. Now, some objectors would also want to say, well, wait a minute. Jesus also calls himself the Son of Man. We'll give you some resources to look into this in more depth, but in one of the oldest Gospels that most New Testament scholars think is the oldest Gospel, which is the book of Mark, Jesus clarifies what he means by the Son of Man title. Again, he's on trial before the religious leadership of the day. They come and they say, who are you? Tell us plainly, are you the Christ, the Son of God? Jesus says, I am. Another I am statement. He says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with God, receiving worship, authority, all these sorts of things. Look back into Daniel chapter 7 or Daniel chapter 9. You can check the resources. The Son of Man figure is this divine messianic figure that Jesus is identifying himself with when he says, I am this Son of Man that's been prophesied or has been spoken about in the Old Testament. Now, having said all of that, C.S. Lewis, came up with an argument, a rather simple argument. We won't go into all the details of it, but the nuts and bolts of the argument is, or it's called first, the trilemma: Lord, liar, or lunatic. Now, the first objection is, well, maybe Jesus was just, I'm willing to accept that Jesus was a good guy. He was a good teacher. He tried to teach people correct concepts in morality. He tried to lead people to do right, blah, 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 blah. But remember, if Jesus is making these radical claims, the claims that we have just spoken of, he is not a good guy. He's a liar of the worst sort. Lord, liar, or lunatic. He's a liar if these claims are not true and he's willfully deceiving these people and telling them that, hey, you can trust me with your eternal destiny. I am the same as God. If you die, don't worry. I've got your back. If you believe in me and follow my teachings, I can forgive you of your sin. I can walk on water. I can feed you with bread that comes from heaven. If he's willfully deceiving people, knowing that these are lies, he's not a good moral teacher. All right, the next option is that he's a lunatic. He's absolutely out of his mind. That's one option. Now, that's a very odd option, that he's a lunatic, in light of the other arguments that we've already given for the resurrection and so on and so forth. But there's also no evidence at all that gives us any reason or compelling reason to think that Jesus is out of his mind. Now, again, you can check the resources to go further into that objection. Now, Dawkins, in the book God Delusion, interestingly enough, says, hey, has nobody thought that C.S. Lewis, great mind as he is, did he not possibly think that maybe Jesus was just mistaken? It doesn't take much intellectual fortitude to understand that that's not a good objection to the trilemma. Why? Because if Jesus is mistaken, that easily fits into the lunatic category. Why? Well, philosopher Ron Nash gives a very easy reason as to why. He says, you're mistaken if you walk into a grocery store and you're in the aisle looking for the milk when you're actually on the bread aisle. That's a mistake. But when you run around making the claims that Jesus made, hey, I'm God, all these titles that you see of Yahweh are mine, you can trust me with your eternal destiny, and so on and so forth, that's not a mistake. That's bat stuff nuts. That's crazy. It's not a simple mistake in light of the claims that Jesus has made about himself. So again, we go into this, if A equals B, B equals C, then A equals C. If Jesus has made these claims about himself that are only equal to God, he applies them to himself, and A must equal C, and we can allow you to draw your own conclusion from that. Now, having gone through this, Jesus asked his own disciples roughly 2,000 years ago, who do you say that I am? Now his disciples replied, well, some people say you're this, some people say you're this, some people say you're this. And Peter says, you're the Son of God. Now, that same question is now before us. Who do you say that this Jesus character is? In light of everything, all of the sessions that we've brought thus far, who do you say that Jesus is? You have to make the same decision that was set forth 2,000 years ago to those individuals. That remains to us as individuals to answer the question, who do we say Jesus is? Are we willing to, as Lewis says, fall down on our feet or fall down on our knees rather and acknowledge him as Lord, as the God of the universe, and give our lives to him and live by his teaching, or cast that aside? That decision is ours at this point to make.